Great. So once again, my name is Monica Granados. I'm an assistant director at Creative Commons, where I run the Open Climate Campaign. I'm so pleased to welcome you today to our event in conjunction with MIT Libraries. Just a couple of other housekeeping announcements. We're using the Zoom functionality today. I think that's the Zoom meeting functionality today, meaning that you can interact with us like you are having a meeting with your colleagues. So you can unmute yourself and speak. You can interact with the chat functionality and ask questions. You can DM me personally if you have any concerns or specific questions that you just want to ask me. So just keep that in mind, that you've got that tool, all those tools available to you, but it also means that we have to be conscious of the fact that if we unmute yourselves, we'll be able to hear any background noise. So just keep that in mind to ensure a successful event today. So today's agenda will be around talking about the intersection of climate change, open, and libraries. I will be giving an introductory presentation to set the context of why we're here today, why we've gathered Chris Bourg and Peter Suber today. We'll have a presentation from Chris Bourg, followed by a question and answer session. Then we'll turn it over to Peter Suber to talk about his experiences at these intersections at Harvard University. And then we will have a brainstorming session where we really want you folks to take the experiences that Chris and Peter will talk about and bring it back to your institutions and discuss what are some challenges to take those things back to your institutions. And, with our collective brains today, help you implement those ideas in your own institutions. Okay, so reminder, if you have any questions, the chat is available to you. I will be monitoring it throughout the entire event and ensuring that the questions go to the right individuals. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about the intersection of open and climate. So climate change and the resulting harm to our global biodiversity is one of the world's most pressing challenges. And there are stories every day in the news about how climate change is exacerbating existing issues or raising new concerns around the effects of climate change on people. Last week, I was in Mexico City. I was in a city near Mexico City called Toluca. I'm originally from Mexico. I was born in Mexico and then immigrated. And when we were in Mexico City, there was a hurricane that hit Acapulco. Acapulco is on the Pacific coast. It's just a couple hours away, actually, from Mexico City. Acapulco was caught completely unprepared for what ended up being a Category 5 hurricane. This is a city that has thrived, even though it's in a hurricane zone, because it's never experienced anything greater than a Category 1 hurricane. All of the infrastructure, all of the preparations, all the way that buildings are built are with the expectation that the worst things can get is a tropical storm or a Category 1 hurricane. And no one expected a Category 5 hurricane to hit this city. In fact, they only had 12 hours notice that what they thought was going to be a Category 1 or a tropical storm, in fact, was going to have winds upwards of 200, 300 kilometers per hour. The science failed us. The science failed the people of Acapulco, the officials, other scientists. Everyone was caught unprepared because the models did not predict that this hurricane was going to turn into a Category 5 hurricane. The science wasn't there because climate change is changing so fast. It is affecting the way we understand, the thermal conduction of oceans so quickly that we need to have access to the science just as quickly. But the reality is that if we're going to solve the world's greatest challenges, the knowledge about them must be open. But open sharing of research is not the default. And many of you folks experience that probably every day in the work that you do. But it's so incredibly important that for climate change and all knowledge, but specifically, to get the data and information that we need to be able to generate models to give people enough time to evacuate, we need access to data and information about climate change. At the Open Climate Campaign, a project that is working to make the open sharing of research the default in climate science, we're working with the current Open Knowledge Initiative to get an idea of how much of climate change research is open. And the last snapshot that we received really showed that only about 43% of climate change publications are open. And we think that that's insufficient. We think what we need to make the open sharing of research the norm in climate science. And we know that we need you. We are so grateful that you are here today because you will be that catalyst. You will be the enablers of moving research to be open. You have so much power at your institutions to ultimately give people greater notice to evacuate, to generate solutions, and to generate mitigations around climate change. And that's why we brought you here today. We brought you here today because we want to empower you to take the information and methodologies and programs that have worked at other institutions back to your institution so that we have access to data and information to help us address the effects of climate change. So we're so glad that you are here today. On behalf of the Open Climate Campaign, I'm so grateful for your attendance. I'm so grateful that Chris Bourg and Peter Stuber are here to share their knowledge and their expertise, and that you're willing to take it home with you and implement it at your institution. So with that, I'm going to move to introducing our first speaker. Chris Bourg is the Director of Libraries at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she also has oversight of MIT Press. She's also the founding director of the Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship. Prior to assuming her role at MIT, Chris worked for 12 years in Stanford University Libraries. Before Stanford, she spent 10 years as an active duty US Army officer, including 3 years on the faculty of the United States Military Academy at West Point. She received her BA from Duke University, her MA from the University of Maryland, and her MA and PhD in sociology from Stanford. Chris has extensive experience in promoting equitable and open scholarship and is an advocate for the role of libraries in promoting social justice and democracy. We're so happy for you to be here today. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Monica, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really a delight for the MIT Libraries to be able to partner with Creative Commons and the Open Climate Campaign to really get the word out about just exactly what you were sharing, Monica, just how important it is to make sure that the research that will help us mitigate the effects of climate change and prepare people for the effects of climate change is openly available, and that everyone can participate in sort of learning about climate change and also sharing what they do know. So really appreciate the opportunity. So my presentation is going to basically, what I want to do in the little bit of time I have here today is give you sort of my own look back at how libraries have advanced open in the past, give you a little context about what we are doing at MIT to advance open and equitable scholarship, and then sort of round home, bring it all home with a bit of a call to action, as we collectively might think about what our next moves on advancing open scholarship is. And I'm doing that all in the context of these intersecting urgencies, right? The urgency of solving climate change, and an urgency I see around open science, right? Monica laid out really, really well the urgent need to find ways to slow the progress of climate change, mitigate the impacts, and that it's important to ensure that the research that'll help us do that is as openly available as possible, that the results, the data, the code, the methods, all of it, opening that up is key to accelerating progress on solutions. And opening it up is also important to ensuring the widest possible exchange of information and ideas from every corner of the planet. I also think, I also think there's an urgency around open science itself. And the urgency, I feel, is sort of less about, are we going to open science up, and more about what path are we going to end up taking as science becomes more open and scholarship becomes more open. Okay, so I think most of us here are likely aware of the 2022 White House Office of Science and Technology Policy memo, also known as the Nelson Memo for the woman responsible for it, then OSTP Director Alondra Nelson. This memo directs federal agencies to eliminate the embargoes on research that they fund, and to make all of the research outputs for federally funded research openly available with no embargo, including data. Here I have to say, give a big shout out to SPARC. SPARC is a library membership organization that played a huge role over decades in advocating for and educating and providing education and awareness building to make this memo possible and make it happen. I will also say that although the memo itself is explicitly agnostic on business models for how to pay for the efforts to make research outputs open, and in fact, the memo contains language that encourage, for example, for articles, manuscript deposit in agency approved repositories as a compliant route for making articles available. So we know that, and the memo says all of that, and yet we've already seen that the commercial publishers, and frankly, even one relatively large society publisher, are already attempting to capitalize on the directive, the White House directive, by doubling down on pay-to-publish models of publication, and by promoting compliance through gold OA. And in a letter that I signed on as one of the 13 directors of an Ivy Plus library, we sent a letter to OSTP when the memo came out, trying to call attention to the danger of allowing the interest of commercial publishers to dictate the path towards compliance. And so that's what I'm talking about, the urgency about right now. We're at a point where there's going to be lock-in on how open science is achieved and how the goals of the OSTP memo are achieved. And I'm worried that it will be achieved in a way that is expensive and inequitable. But I want to take a minute just to sort of look back and understand sort of how we got here, to a place where we get this groundbreaking and very welcome move by the White House to support immediate open access to not just articles, but to data. So how did we get to this place where that happens? And yes, it's a cause for celebration, but for many of us, it is also a cause for some concern. And so what I'm going to give you is sort of my, Chris Bourg's abbreviated, very biased view of recent history of libraries and open. So take it with as many grains of salt as you want. But in my view, right, in the US at least, libraries kind of took the lead on promoting open access and promoting open scholarship. About 20 so years ago, we took the lead on our institutions and on our campuses in trying to push open access. And most of the rhetoric that we use was, in the beginning, was about we started talking about a journals crisis, right? And so libraries started talking about a journals crisis where we were trying to highlight to our communities that, journal prices were skyrocketing while our budgets were shrinking. And that's a true argument. That was based on data. But it was not an argument or a tactic that frankly won us many allies outside of the libraries. Sort of hinging our support for open on the journals crisis didn't turn out to be a coalition building move. Now, on some campuses, and so we struggled to build coalition. And then another thing that happened was on those campuses that were able to rally their faculty to pass an open access policy, and I'll talk about that in a second, many of those policies were implemented in a way to ensure that we placed minimum burden on the faculty, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm all for minimizing everybody's administrative burdens and unnecessary burdens. But by minimizing, by passing a faculty open access policy and ensuring that it would only be accomplished with minimum burden to the faculty, we kind of let faculty off the hook. It meant that faculty never really had to change their behavior. And so libraries took on the burden of trying to change the system of scholarly communication towards open almost by themselves. And we tried to do it at the negotiating table with publishers. And so to some extent, this has meant that much of the work to try and open up access to scholarly journals has been accomplished by asking some of the least powerful actors in the system, the libraries, to take on some of the most powerful actors in the system, the commercial publishers. And so the fact that we've made any progress is pretty remarkable. Hats off to all of you in the trenches doing that work. I will also note that when we sign read and publish deals or any kind of pay to publish deals on behalf of our communities, we're once again relieving faculty of really any responsibility for changing their behavior or helping to change a system that in many ways they have created. So here we are, I think at this point of urgency, where we are at risk of locking in a model for OA journal publishing that ensures that the commercial publishers still get to reap the same profit margins off of the scholarship that our communities are creating and reviewing. So what can we do? And here's where I'm going to share a little bit about what we're doing at MIT. And I do this not to brag, although there's plenty to brag about because I have an amazing team all across the board who does a huge range of kinds of work to support our work to advance open and equitable scholarship. And so I guess I did just brag. I can't help but many of them are on this call, and they really are an amazing, amazing team from top to bottom. But I also am sharing what we're doing there because I hope that we can, by sharing what we've learned, it will be helpful to others, and we can start to again build that collective action around our shared interest and our shared strengths. So, it just starts off very simply that at MIT, one of our 6 strategic principles is a commitment to openness and equity in scholarship. We are relentless in our pursuit of a more open and equitable scholarly landscape that prioritizes inclusion and reduces the marginalization of scholars from disadvantaged communities. That's right there in our enduring vision as one of our top 6 enduring principles. And, you know, sort of the cornerstone of our open scholarship strategy since 2009, when we passed a faculty open access policy, has been getting faculty articles openly available in our repository. And I'm super proud of the fact that we have about 60% of faculty articles produced by MIT faculty are openly available in our repository in DSpace. That's a remarkable figure, and I'm pretty sure it's the highest figure of any major research university in the US. And people are using them, right? We've had nearly 24 million downloads over 14 years. And also our theses and dissertations are open by default. We have more than 58,000 theses that have been completed at MIT by MIT graduate students openly available in our repository, and those date back to the mid-1800s. Huge amount of scholarship that we're making openly available. And again, hats off to the team at the MIT libraries who does most of that work. Some of the other ways we advance open scholarship is via a new cash prize that we give to early career researchers who use or create open data in creative and impactful ways. We ran this open data prize competition and event for the first time last year. We weren't sure how popular it would be, and we ended up with over 70 nominations the first year, and we just did the second round this year and had over 80 nominations. And a big event. We award 10 prizes both years, and also because the projects were so amazing, we ended up giving out almost as many honorable mentions as well. We also have an open monograph fund where we will support MIT authors who want to make their monographs open and need funding for a subvention fee for that. And we also, about 4 years ago, launched a research center within the libraries called the Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship, where we have hosted and supported research scientists, visiting scholars, and postdoctoral researchers who are conducting research to help us understand sort of things like the incentives for engaging in open scholarship, who will help us analyze economic models, who have helped us analyze the relationship between openness and equity in the scholarly landscape. But perhaps one final way, and the one that I really want to talk about, that we're trying to advance open, is by sharing what we know and what we've learned through our recent experience with Elsevier. So just to cut to the chase, for those of you who don't know, MIT has been out of contract with Elsevier since June of 2020. So we canceled our contract with Elsevier in June of 2020 and have been out of contract with them, not just canceling our big deal, but out of contract with them for a journals contract for over 3 years now. And we've learned a lot from that process that we think would be valuable to others. So the first thing is that the path to being able to cancel that contract started more than a year before we actually canceled it, right? It started with developing something we call the MIT Framework for Publisher Negotiations and Publisher Contracts. It's the main, if the main tool that libraries have in advancing open is sitting across the table negotiating with publishers, then we at MIT wanted to be purposeful and transparent with our community about what were the principles we were using in that negotiation, what were we trying to get, and we wanted to get buy-in. And so we created the MIT framework, we shopped it around our community, socialized it with our community, got buy-in from MIT senior leadership, from the deans, from a number of department heads across the community. And we also, the MIT framework was also endorsed by about 200 or more other institutions and other libraries. These are the elements of the MIT framework. Key for us was that we felt that we wanted to negotiate with we wanted to sign contracts with publishers who did not require our authors to opt out of our own policy, right? We wanted to sign contract with publishers who allowed our authors to retain their rights. At the time, we were looking for auto deposit of author accepted manuscripts into our institutional repository. We wanted language that provided good computational access as part of the contract. And, the tricky part was we wanted cost transparency, and we wanted to know what are the services that we're paying for if we're going to sign a contract with you. We have signed about a dozen contracts with publishers since we adopted the framework, publishers of all kinds that align with the framework. None of them are 100% in meeting every element, but those contracts that we have signed all show movement and willingness towards openness and transparency and the equity that we're looking for when we sign contracts. Notably, Elsevier was not able to produce a framework aligned contract, not able or not willing. So with the backing of MIT leadership, we ended negotiations and went out of contract in June of 2020. And then Elsevier went silent for 2 years. We went along with our business, and I'll tell you how we managed being out of contract. But after about 2 years, and in that intervening time, Elsevier had signed a very large pay-to-publish deal with the University of California system, and they signed a similar deal with JISC in Europe. Then they came back to us and asked, can we try again? So we were willing to try again, and we even simplified our ask from the full framework. We prioritized 3 elements of the framework: the no OLA policy waiver, a fair and transparent cost, and a deal that would advance global equity in the system in some way. Basically, they ultimately offered us a standard read and publish deal with no more cost transparency than what's already available on their website, and at a price point that didn't make sense for us. And by didn't make sense for us, and this is the takeaway I want everyone to hear loud and clear, we've done extensive analysis on the contract that they offered us and on sort of what it is that we're doing now. So right now, the libraries is paying for needed access to recent Elsevier content, because of course we have perpetual access to everything before we went out of contract. But for the new content that we don't have access to because we're out of contract, we're paying per article to make sure that our community has the scholarship that they need to do their research and learning. And when we did the analysis of the costs, it turns out that we are paying 10% of what we used to pay for a big Elsevier contract. 10%. And even after you add in what our community is paying for APCs in the wild, it's still orders of magnitude cheaper to both read and to publish per article than anything in any big contract that Elsevier was willing to put on the table. So I just want to repeat that one more time. Going without a big contract with Elsevier means that we at MIT Libraries are currently paying 1/10 of what we were paying before we canceled, because we're only paying for what our scholars actually read. Okay, so let that sit for a while, and let's look ahead. What can and should libraries do to advance open scholarship, and how desire to move towards open on the part of funders as well. And then what I really want to talk about is that we can repurpose our collections budget in support of systemic and cultural change in the system. So when I say leveraging our power, like, I totally get how hard it is to get the support of faculty and campus leaders to walk away from a big contract that they're used to having access to. It's part of why I'm sharing the MIT success story. Again, we've been out of contract for 3 years, and we are saving millions of dollars a year because we're paying 1/10 of what we used to pay. Again, partly I'm bragging because I think it's remarkable, but also I want others to see what we did. We can talk, I'm happy to talk to anyone in more detail about exactly how we did it, but also so that people can share our success story on their campus, right? MIT is a pretty big, prestigious, research-intensive university, and we're continuing to do pretty good work here at MIT without an Elsevier contract. So I think that that might be a message that would resonate. I also think we absolutely have to be willing, when we're at the negotiating table, we have to be willing to walk away. As a former colleague at Stanford used to say to me, unless you're willing to walk away, you're not really negotiating, you're just talking. And I think that to do that, we need clarity about why we're walking away and what we hope to accomplish. So when we initially walked away from Elsevier in 2020, we were hoping that us walking away, at the time the UC system was also out of contract, and we were hoping that that combination would sort of build a coalition and a groundswell of US universities walking away from their Elsevier contracts that would then compel Elsevier to maybe make some changes in what they So the second time we walked away, it was really because we saw the cost savings ways that were more aligned with our goals and values and could actually advance openness. So repurposing our collections budget requires that we analyze and forecast the total cost of reading and publishing under different futures and models. And we're doing a project right now, we're doing exactly that. And the bottom line from our analysis is that per article reading is far cheaper than these big bulk contracts where we pay for a lot of content that doesn't get read, and paying to publish either by article in the wild from research grants, or via library contracts where we pay in bulk for our community to publish. That's also costly and is likely to get a lot more expensive. It's also totally opaque. And I guess the bottom line here is that the contracts that we tend to sign as libraries are not offering any economies of scale for us. So there are costs to publishing, and they have to be paid somehow and by someone. But I think what I'm trying to say is that I don't think they have to be opaque. I don't think the cost has to be uncontrolled. And I don't think it has to include high profit margins that we know some commercial publishers enjoy. There has to be a better way. And we have to invest in alternative publishing routes and systems that are controlled not by corporate interest, but by the interests of scholars and their institutions. And to do that, to scale up existing nonprofit and university press infrastructures, we need to find funding. And I think what I'm trying to say here is we have the funding. It's just a matter of shifting that library collections budget and only paying for the content that your scholars really need. And there's a lot of savings to be had there, especially if we were to build coalition. So in summary, I just feel like we are really at this point where there is a very important window of opportunity, both for charting the right course for scholarly communications and for open access, for repurposing collections funds to do that, and also to target our research and our efforts around open on urgent issues and big challenges such as climate change. So I am happy to stop sharing and take some questions now.
Thanks so much, Chris, for your insights. We do have a couple of questions, so I'll go ahead and start sending them along from the chat. I invite folks to continue to ask questions on the chat. If you're more comfortable with asking it verbally, do raise your hand and I'll call upon you. We had a question that was partly answered in the chat here. There's a question that said, that's great. What staff manages the per article purchasing? What department? We had an answer from Lisa that said it's a service called Reprint's Desk. It's managed through unmediated ILL workflows. So once the initial setup was set up by ILL, it runs unmediated. ILL was manually checking for duplicates for a while, so save article costs, but the staffing costs and time were more expensive than the duplicates, so we stopped. I actually have a question to add on top of that. As someone who was a practicing researcher in my previous life, is there any like friction to get those articles when you're sort of asking them in a sort of a pay-per-use basis? Working with other researchers, they're so used to just being able to like click the DOI or the link and get it straight away. Do you face a little bit of resistance? Yeah. Is there a resistance like logistically?
So I kind of, yeah. Thank you for that question, because I kind of buried the lead there. In addition to being, like I said, 10% of the cost of our old Elsevier contract, the articles that are coming in through this service that we implemented, and thank you to my team who's putting all the answers in the chat there, are coming at I think close to 95% of the articles come to the researcher in less than a minute. So there is a little bit of friction. It is not the same as being in Science Direct and just hitting get PDF, right? You have to get the article, the form auto populates, it sends the request off, and then you get an email with the article. So the turnaround time is extremely quick. It's a little bit of friction. But when I go to senior leadership and I say, is 45-second difference or 30-second difference worth several $1 million a year? And it's a pretty easy answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess, so I wonder, is part of that, of that work is also to have communications around that figure that you just said, so that researchers don't feel like, well, why am I getting a poor service? Can you talk a little bit about maybe how you've communicated that in the event that you sort of have seen some resistance from researchers?
Well, so that's another part of the lead that I buried as well. Sorry. So couple of answers to that. One, when we first walked away from Elsevier and announced that back in 2020 that we would no longer have a contract with Elsevier, we kept, and to this date, we keep track of the feedback that we get directly from faculty. And it was 10-to-1 positive. The negative comments were all about, how do I get access to research that I'm going to need? And we would, again, incredible team of liaison librarians and access service staff and all across the libraries doing that interface with the faculty and educating them on how to get access to articles that we no longer would have access through Science Direct. And almost to a T, when we explained to folks how we get access, when we're doing it just by ILL and it was only a little bit of content because we weren't out of contract for very long, it wasn't too bad. But then frankly, it was mostly our biomedical community that really needed instant access to the current literature, and was part of the impetus behind us contracting with Reprint's Desk with even faster access. And once we tell folks that that's how you do it, they're like, oh, okay. Now, there might be some complaints out there in the wild that haven't come to us. But so far, when we explain to people sort of the cost savings and as Aaron put in the chat, 97% of your articles are going to get to you in less than a minute. The resistance goes down, the concerns go down quite a bit.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. The reason that I'm sort of pushing back on this, because I think those are probably concerns in the back of the minds of a lot of participants today. And I hear that a lot in the type of advocacy that the Open Climate Campaign does, just around just fear of moving away from the status quo and not knowing that it's going to be okay. And I think MIT Libraries is such a great example where we did the thing and it was okay. And it was better than okay. Here we've got 9/10 of a budget now to make things better than okay. And so, digging down into these concerns that are not sufficient to prevent you from doing this big thing that in the end will have such a positive outcome in the availability of access to research. We've got a couple of other questions from the chat. There was a really great question here that I think we've touched a little bit on, but how do you get buy-in from faculty to walk away?
Yeah, that was, again, a really long process. So we we have a faculty committee on the on libraries, and we used that committee extensively, right? Got them all on board. They went with us to go and do presentations at various schools, to department heads and to other faculty. We co-wrote some op-eds in the faculty newsletter to try and talk about, way before we were even in active negotiations with Elsevier, to talk about the framework and the principles we wanted to use in negotiations, and to explain how those principles were completely aligned with a faculty OA policy and sort of other things that were happening in principles and values of the academy. So we talked about, here are the principles. We're going to use these principles. And that might mean that some publishers won't be able to meet these principles. And so if you buy into these principles, you're buying in ahead of time that we will really negotiate. And that might mean that we'll walk away. And here's some of the ways that we would mitigate the impacts of walking away. But once you say you bought into these principles, if we come back later and say we tried to negotiate on the principles and publisher X wasn't willing, you've already told us we can walk away. So that was really important, to make it about the principles first and get buy-in on that. But with, again, with full understanding that it might mean that we'd walk away. But it was really important that we had our own faculty we had faculty in every school who were advocates and sort of liaisons around this for us. But it took a long time, and it took a lot of going out and doing presentations and talking to people.
Yeah, and it sounds like a lot of organization too. So I think that's something that we talked a little bit about too, is, thinking about, is there a way that we can put all of these learnings somewhere to be able to also share with attendees today, and also to a wider audience of, like, how could they do the same thing in their own institution. And I think there's just a lot of learnings. I think we're hearing that in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Got another question here that says, have any of your negotiations included conversations about the free labor of your affiliated scholars who edit, review, and otherwise contribute to journals?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Hi, Sam. So if you maybe one of my colleagues could drop a link to the framework into the chat, because if you read the intro to the framework, we're actually really clear about that I think there's a phrase in there that says, the value of scholarship comes from the labor, the value in a scholarly article is based on the labor of the authors who wrote it, the scholars who review it, the institutions that supported that. So we tried to make really clear that we believe that that's sort of where the value comes from. So we only want to pay publishers for any value add on top of that. So that's how we sort of think about that issue and how we write about that issue.
Again, that's really helpful. Just saw that they have dropped the link to the framework. That was actually one of my questions. Again,
have I mentioned how awesome my team is?
Yeah, for sure. This feels scripted. Your team is amazing, and let me speak from experience of organizing this. Your team is absolutely wonderful. A pleasure to work with. I think that's all the questions that we have right now. We'll have some time again at the end of the presentations to talk a little bit more about this and ask more questions. I think what we'll do is we'll move over to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Peter Bourg. Peter Bourg is the Senior Advisor on Open Access at Harvard Library. He's also the director of the Harvard Open Access Project. By training, he's a philosopher and lawyer and gave up his position as a tenured full professor of philosophy in 2003 to work full-time on open access. He was the principal drafter of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, sits on the boards of many groups devoted to open access and scholarly communication, and has been active in fostering open access for many years through his research, speaking, and writing. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, Peter. I have all of your books, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Monica. Everybody has all my books. They're free. Monica left out one thing. She and I are both here on behalf of the Open Climate Campaign. The purpose of the OCC is to open up access to climate research. And I want to talk about that today. I'd be happy to talk about any other aspect of open access in the Q&A, but I want to drill down into opening up climate research. I'm not giving a presentation like Chris. I'm really giving some opening remarks to stimulate discussion, to generate some good ideas in the brainstorming session. And let me start this way. The Open Climate Campaign has a Get Involved page in which it tells different sorts of stakeholders, researchers, national governments, funders, environmental organizations, what they could do to help open up climate research. We don't yet have a page on what libraries could do to help open up climate research. And we want to use today's meeting to generate some good ideas. I'm going to put that in the chat so you can follow that up later. And I want to prime the pump by mentioning two ideas quickly. One thing a library could do is to see who's doing climate research at that institution, and then look for new publications on climate from those researchers. There are a couple ways to do that. For example, you could look for climate-related research with your institutional ROR. That'll work to some degree, but many publications don't include the author's ROR or institutional ID. But when they do, it makes tracking this kind of research more convenient. Another way to do it is to identify the climate researchers themselves by name and track their publications. Some will be on climate, some will not. But then when they're not published in open access journals, reach out to them and try to get a copy of the peer-reviewed manuscript for the repository. That requires giving some library person hours to the job of monitoring the publications of these climate researchers, but it's one way to accomplish the task, and it is worth it. Now, here's a second idea. It's more complicated. Basically, fast track the climate research done by the people at your institution. And let me give an example. We did this with COVID research at Harvard, starting almost as soon as the pandemic exploded. This was in March 2020. We had a good number of COVID researchers at Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health, Harvard Biology Department, and elsewhere. And we wanted to get their work into DASH, our open access repository, as soon as possible. And let me just digress for a second to say, we don't normally get things into the repository instantly. We get more submissions to the repository than we can process immediately. I'm assuming this is a fairly common problem. If your institution is able to put a submission live in the repository the same day, all the time, you're very lucky. I wish we could do that. We couldn't. So we have a queue. We have a waiting list, and we go through it as quickly as we can. We call this the friction embargo. It's an unofficial, undesirable embargo. It's just caused by the friction of having to process every submission. The processing is what you'd expect. We have to make sure the metadata is good. We have to make sure it's really by an institutional affiliate. We have to make sure it's a version that we're allowed to share, and so on. There are a few other things. When we say we fast-tracked COVID research into the repository, what I mean is we put it at the front of the line. We asked the authors of COVID research to let our office know that they had just submitted a COVID-related piece of research into the queue. And then our repository manager, Colin Lukens, manually put it at the front of the line, and we got it open in Dash the same day. And so there's a little bit of labor on the repository side, not a lot, and of course it's worth it. And just to give you an example of how this worked, we announced this in March of 2020, and in June of 2020, we had more than 1 million downloads from Dash. Most of those were the COVID-related papers. That was our best download month ever in the history of the repository. The first paper that we fast-tracked in Dash got more than 21,000 downloads in the first 4 days. And I'm not predicting the same thing for climate. One reason is that I think COVID was a fast-moving crisis, and climate is a slow-moving crisis. And so people needed access to COVID research, and they knew they needed it immediately. I wish more people thought the same way about climate, but they don't. And it's urgent without being without requiring the same degree of timeliness that COVID research did at the time. But I think if any institution announced a fast-tracking open access program for climate research, they would get similar numbers. They would see a spike in downloads, and they would certainly serve all researchers and policymakers working on climate. We talked about doing the same thing for climate. We did it for COVID, as I say, and we talked about doing it for climate, and we faced an obstacle that you might face as well, which is we have many, many more climate researchers than we have COVID researchers. So it was actually doable for us to fast track all of our COVID research, and it wasn't immediately doable to do the same thing for climate. And while we were looking around for ways to fund that or make it feasible, I retired. I retired last year, but it's still an idea worth pursuing. It's still one that I'm talking with my colleagues about. I'd like to see any other institution do the same thing. If you'd like to do it and learn more about how we did the COVID fast tracking program, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. While we're talking about this, let me add one more URL to the chat. This is just a blog post that my office put out to draw attention to the fast tracking project. When I tested the URL before the call, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So I'm sorry. If it doesn't work for you, try again shortly. It'll work soon. And so with that as preface, let me just urge all of you in the following brainstorming session to suggest ways that libraries could help open up climate research. We'd like to know about them at the Open Climate Campaign. And of course, every library would like to be able to do what it can to facilitate or accelerate climate research itself.
Thanks, Peter. Just move over here to just pinning my video. Thank you so much, Peter. Again, thank you so much, Chris, for your presentations. As Peter mentioned, one of the outcomes that we would like to have from this webinar is not only information out to give you examples that have worked effectively at 2 institutions, but also to hear from you about what's the kind of information that would help you implement these ideas in your institution. And the Open Climate Campaign is a 4-year fully funded project that has capacity to assist libraries to put in place some of these some of these ideas that we talked about today. So it would be just great to hear, what are other things that you have done at your own institution that you didn't hear about today? We also could talk a little bit about what are some challenges at your institution that perhaps collectively we could brainstorm around addressing and reducing the friction to implement these ideas, particularly with the context of the urgency of climate change and the need to make this information open as quickly as possible. So I'd love to hear, again, you can unmute yourself or use the chat function. We've got a lot of folks here today. I'll get the conversation started about, Chris, early on you talked about, sort of the responsibility being shifted away from researchers to implement open practices, and that, the burden has fallen often on, academic library staff. How do we convince researchers to come back into the fold? When I do that kind of advocacy, the first thing that I hear is, I've got too much to do. I'm not interested. Or there's often a lot of misinformation where they're like, well, open access is too expensive, I don't even want to think about it. So what are some ideas on how you can get researchers to join this movement with librarians who are often already very, very motivated to do this work?
So I do have some thoughts on that. And so if you don't mind me jumping in.
Yes, please.
I actually think that this is where the Nelson memo is transformative for us, right? So now we can have the conversations with faculty who do receive federal funding, and we can talk to them not about this, not about open up your research for the public good because it's a good thing to do. And, again, the response becomes, this is just an additional burden, because we all know that sharing data openly in any kind of fair and accessible way is really hard work. And even sharing the right version of your article openly can be time consuming. But now the story is, look, you're going to have to share your article and the data and the code and everything else immediately as a result of this, as a condition of this funding. So you're going to have to do the work. So let's talk about, how can we make sure in your department that work is rewarded and incentivized? Mm-hmm. Like you're doing the work anyway. So let's talk to department heads and to provost about, how do we make sure that faculty are properly rewarded, supported and rewarded for doing this work. And recognizing that, at any given institution, I think at our institution, something between 55 and 60% of the research at MIT is federally funded in some kind of way. And it'll be a different percentage at different institutions, but that's a pretty good chunk of research. So for me, I think part of the tactic is to talk about that. Like, we're not adding a new burden. That's coming anyway. So let's make sure that work, you know how to do it, and that it's incentivized and rewarded and recognized. I've recently started thinking that, we spend a lot of time trying to convince scholars who are sort of outliers in their stubbornness, perhaps. We either try to convince them, or we keep talking to the choir of the ones that are already convinced that opening up their scholarship is the way to go. And I see as Monica, as you said, that there's a lot of education and awareness raising that we can do with those folks in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often think that like libraries are that first interface. You know, that is when I was a graduate student, when I was a postdoc, when I was a researcher, like that was my interface. And at first, actually, the first time I heard it, I was like, I actually didn't put two and two together. Like I didn't realize that the library was going to be that hub, that like introduction or my interface with open. And so I think there probably is a lot of like a lack of information, even to the point of like libraries are the place you should go, particularly when you get this like top down, like, action of the Nelson memo. And you're wondering, well, now what do I do? Who do I turn to? Do I Google this? And like, well, your library will probably have a lot of that information. And like you said, I think this is a really good time to capitalize on this like wave, particularly in the United States, but it's happening all across the world and in Europe and Latin America, to move towards open as the default. One element or one link that I want to share, particularly around the incentives and rewards. There is a new it's relatively new, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, that is taking that sort of organization approach, which I think has come up a lot in our discussion today, and you'll probably hear it more generally as well, that, we have to organize. I think why like MIT was able to be as successful as possible as you were is because you organized. You did the communication work. You organized around faculty. You organized around your academic library system. When you organize collectively, you're going to have a lot more power. And so Quora is another example of like trying to coalesce around the concept of revising research assessment and doing it in a collective way. Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I just wanted to build on what Chris said and reply to Sam's question in the chat at the same time. He says, depositing data and code will be the bottleneck in sharing climate research. And he's right that sharing data and code is often harder than sharing the text of an article. But I can build on what Chris said, because the Nelson memo requires sharing the data too. Not so much code, but at least the data. And so federally funded authors, who are still the majority of most of our institutions, will have to deposit and share both their text and their data. And we can help them figure out how to do that. And the same goes with code. When it's not required by the funder to share code, we can point them to places where they can share code, for example, through GitHub. If they don't know how to use that, we can, that is, librarians can help explain that to them. Harvard has a specialized data repository apart from its text repository. That's not strictly necessary, and not all schools have it. You can deposit data and code in the ordinary repository. Most of these repositories are designed to accept arbitrary file types. The question is, what metadata do you use? What's the deposit process, and so on? That might have to be adapted. But when the funder allows compliance through external repositories, or maybe specific repositories that it names other than your own institutional repository, librarians can help them comply by pointing them in the right direction and telling them how. There's a lot of information online of the how-to variety, how to share your code and data the best way. And librarians can master that literature and point scholars in the right direction.
Thanks, Peter. I think there's another idea here in the chat. Jessica Ryan, if you want to speak to it verbally, please unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm happy to read your comment here.
Oh, no, it's fine. I just, it felt like a kind of minor thing that I've done in my little.
No, I think it's huge. That's why I wanted to spotlight it.
But what Peter was saying, like, this is what we should do. And I was like, oh, I always feel like, oh, good. That is what I am trying to do. I kind of tried to highlight and lift up the climate research at SPIF and to talk about not just in terms of STEM, but also the humanities contribution to this effort that's so important. So that was one little stab that I tried to make. So thank you, Peter, for kind of confirming that that's at least moving in the right direction.
I can build on that and also respond to an earlier question about getting faculty on board. When we approached our COVID researchers and asked them about our fast tracking project, they were 100% on board. They wanted to share their work as quickly as possible. And I think climate researchers would feel exactly the same way. It may be harder in other disciplines, but in COVID and climate, I think all the researchers are already on board. All they're looking for is a helping hand.
And folks in the audience, Peter just mentioned, what they're looking for is a helping hand. Do you feel like there is something that can help you give that helping hand? Like, is there resistance? Like, as part again of an open climate campaign, we want to know what some of those barriers are so that we can help take down those barriers. What would help to do more of that the highlighting the.
I can mention a couple things.
Yeah.
First of all, the agencies will require sharing funded research, but they will require it to be shared through what's called a designated repository. It won't just be any old repository. And the last time this happened under the Obama administration, none of the agencies allowed authors to comply by depositing in their institutional repository. Even though that was perfectly good OA, the agencies designated separate, usually federally sponsored repositories. I predict that's what's going to happen again. So one thing librarians can do is to help authors figure out which designated repository they must deposit in. Even if they also deposit in the institutional repository, which will always be permissible, they must deposit in the one that the agency designates. Under the Obama administration, this kind of policy only applied to about 24 agencies. This time around, it applies to every single agency that funds research. And by the way, not even the OMB knows how many that is. It's at least 400. So there'll be at least 400 designated repositories to learn. Most of them will overlap. There'll be many duplicates, and maybe there'll only be 20 different repositories. But if a scholar at your institution is funded by a given agency, we can help that person learn which repository is designated by that agency. Now, the other thing I can point out is that, again, building on earlier pieces of the discussion, when a journal charges an APC, then they might give the impression that authors must pay the APC in order to comply with their federal funding agency. That's false. That's misleading. We have to educate our scholars so that they don't draw the wrong conclusion. If a journal charges an APC, it's only charging to publish in that journal. Now, complying with the federal funding agency policy is free of charge. It'll always be free of charge. If the scholar doesn't want to pay that fee or can't find a sponsor to pay that fee for them, they can publish in a different journal, or they can deposit in the institutional repository without paying the fee at the journal. Many journals are going to mislead authors this way, deliberately or inadvertently. And part of our job will be to help them see that compliance is free of charge.
Yeah, I really do want to highlight that this is an opportunity for this community to step up. It's not just, like librarians, but, other researchers who are advocates of OA, that message needs to come forward. And first and foremost, every time I've given a talk about open access, the first concern is it's too expensive. There has been a systematic quieting of other open access routes that don't require an article processing charge, because it's, the community is not as well resourced as publishers who, have the marketing and communication budget to send the message out that OA is the gold route. So we really have to counter that narrative, and particularly with the implementation of the policies around that are being called by the Nelson memo. I think we have to step that up even more, because I think that the message around open is going to be diluted, and we will miss this opportunity to shift people over, to preprints, to green open access, to diamond open access. Cable Green, your hand is up. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Monica. This is a question for Peter or Chris or both. Just last week was the Diamond Open Access Conference in Toluca, Mexico. In Chris's slides, she was talking about, when we're dealing with these public goods like open science, it's going to be important to have nonprofit, university press infrastructure to provide the kind of infrastructure support and services that we need to do open science. And so I'm just wondering, we've talked about the importance of the Nelson memo at length. Do you think there's an importance around community-owned and operated infrastructure? And if so, how important is that? Is that going to be important to solve the UN SDGs, climate included? And I guess the second part of the question is, how do we get there? How do we get to move from here to there? I think Chris started some of that conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, what a great question. And yes, and 3,000 more yeses to everything you said. So, I mean, I think what I'm trying to lay out is a recognition that it does cost to publish, right? But there are models that are run by nonprofits and university press that both return control of scholarship to scholars and their institutions who are values aligned, but also who are implementing business models that are either Diamond OA, which is essentially ensuring that there's a sustainable funding for a journal, or subscribe to open, which there's different models, but it's basically using usually library budgets that used to go to paying to read, to paying a similar amount as a risk mitigation strategy for the publisher, so that they know that they're going to get enough money year on year to open up their content. And I think that the money that we as a community of libraries need to invest in Diamond OA and subscribe to open models can come from, like I said, this window of opportunity in the year and a half before the Nelson memo takes effect, of trying to move as many of our big bloated contracts to a per article basis and save that money, pool it with the rest of us, and we could really invest in some serious flipping of journals in an interesting way, and moving control of a lot of the scholarly output to these more sustainable models and ones that are values aligned.
I'll just add here. I support Green OA and Diamond OA in large part because they avoid APCs. APCs do make the result open access to readers, but they exclude authors who can't find the money. That's inequitable. We have to do better. Many publishers who do charge APCs recognize that, and they're looking for ways to move away from them. Public Library of Science is a good example. Now we have 3 business models that are avoid APCs or dispense with APCs. As Chris said, there's a growing number of business models to pay the costs of Diamond or no APC journals. I encourage journals to look at those before they decide they won't work for them. There's more than one, there's more than a dozen of them, and there are more coming all the time. I also encourage creative thinking about new ones, that is even experimentation on what else could help pay the expenses at Diamond journals. We need open infrastructure to support both Diamond OA journals and Green OA repositories. So these are all knit together. At the same time, someone mentioned Cora. We also need to reform research assessment. That's also knit together with these. If we do reform research assessment, then it will matter much less where somebody published their research. and it'll matter much more how good it is. And one drawback to Diamond Away for some authors is that those journals don't always carry the same level of prestige as the venerable journals in their field. But research assessment can take care of that. I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, I think it's one of the long-term, slow-moving campaigns of the open access movement. But that's why it's integrated with these other goals. We won't make a lot of progress on Diamond Away until we also make progress on research assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think we've talked a lot about different resources today. Chris, in your presentation, you mentioned, you know, that there was at least a year lead up to doing this work. And so one of the things that, you know, I want to ask the audience here, and maybe just put it in the chat, is what kind of resources would you want to have to start to tackle what may feel like a really difficult and arduous process that maybe you're scared to start? How can we equip you with that information? How can we equip you with resources, with examples, with case studies that you can take and at least start the planning process? Because, you know, as Chris mentioned, it's going to take at least a year to, you know, to start having these conversations, to start making the connections with, you know, with your with leadership to be able to make these decisions. So I would love to hear in the chat, what are the kinds of resources that you would need? We'll also follow up with a survey. I think it would be really helpful to hear, you know, what kind of resources do you need so that we can make a action kit for libraries and librarians in particular, to have you take that information and implement it in your own institution. So please do put anything in the chat, and we'll follow up as well. I want to give an opportunity to see if there's any more questions or anything that you want to bring up to our experts here, or other experts that you know, that haven't presented today but have years of experience in open access and in this movement. You can do that by raising your hand. Okay, perfect. I see. Apologies if I mispronounced it. Mirna?
Yes, Mirna. I'm not with any institution. I am a researcher. I have a PhD in libraries, and I work with frontline communities who are directly impacted by climate chaos and climate change. And so trying to sit here and like recognizing that the answer, right, if we're really trying to address climate urgency, actually comes from those communities that are directly impacted by climate change and climate chaos, and trying to figure out what are some of the avenues for people who are non-traditionally a part of faculty who actually do make their work doing research on the ground available. Like what, I mean, and so in this case, like if this is a call to action, how would this be something that I could respond to, or that people within my communities can respond to without it being exploitative, or without it being like a one-trick pony, this is the one thing we do, and not necessarily commit to it fully. Thank you.
Peter or Chris, if you want to start it off. No.
Yeah, hi, Mirna. I leave it to you to ask the really tough question that stumps everyone, but the right question, 100%, you know, a really good question. You know, I tend to believe that ensuring that scholarship is open for everyone to read, whether they're affiliated with a university or not, is super important. And as you brought up, to me, it also has to be, you know, if we accept that as a planet, we sort of rely on science that is communicated and scholarship that is communicated in the relatively traditional ways that it's happening, then I think it's also important that getting the knowledge from communities that don't necessarily have access to funds for APCs or the whole infrastructure of a university, as you said, somehow figuring out ways to have that knowledge included as part of the conversation, I think is really hard. But the current system absolutely has barriers up to it. So if we break down those barriers in terms of participation in that scholarly conversation, I think that helps. But I don't have a magic bullet, to be honest.
Yeah, my suggestion would be, and you know, to be careful to not do this in an exploitative way, but like, how do you bring these folks to the table? When particularly climate change researchers are doing their work, it's a lot of ones and zeros and models, and you know, a lot of facts about how the climate is changing. The temperature went up this much, or a species range changed. And I think there isn't, you know, something that like I've been talking about in the intersection of like open culture is like the context, that human context. And I wonder if like doing more partnerships, and this could come from academic libraries, doing partnerships with like community organizations who are being impacted, to be part of these conversations, to have also that, you know, the communication with scientists to say, you want to know why you have to have your work open is because it's impacting my community, you know, that, and I'm here to talk to you about it. And this is why you have to, in particular, why you have to make this work open and make that part of the communication strategy, but really centered around how do we elevate those voices in this discussion, because we're having this discourse about how important climate change research is without really the people who are probably are marginalized and are being that marginalization is being exacerbated by climate change. And so, you know, that I think that's an actionable, a call to action. Bring in these communities into your discussions in what sometimes can feel as sort of like, you know, these ivory towers, as it were.
I can add this. When we talk about open access journals and open access repositories, we often encounter resistance based on the inconvenience or the novelty of this compared to how scholars used to publish things. But what these complaints don't realize is that the current subscription model is not sustainable, not convenient either. And it has long delays before work appears, and then there are paywalls that exclude readers. There are also author side fees that are not APCs, but they are page and color charges that function to exclude authors as well. And so when we remind people of the inconveniences, the barriers to ordinary, traditional, conventional paywalled publication, then we can make it easier for them to recognize that open access is part of the solution. It solves those problems, but it also helps accelerate solutions to climate change, to COVID, to other important problems. And then, of course, it's something librarians can help with. Scholars don't have to solve all these problems without help. They have help.
Thanks so much, Peter and Chris. We're just about out of time. I wanted to make 2 announcements. The first is that we're working to make put together or organize a second event around the intersection of open and climate and the role of libraries. It will really focus around the erosion of materials and culture and history due to climate change and how open can make this material available. From a recent presentation that we gave at the Creative Commons Global Summit, myself and Brigitte Zina, who works on the open culture side at Creative Commons, she had this slide that showed that 56% of galleries, libraries, and museums report increased damage to their collections due to water or moisture because of climate change. So like we're losing materials like knowledge and some materials that are not digitized, that are not open, to climate change. So climate change is really having having an effect on the materials themselves. So we're looking to organize our next event around that discussion. And then the last thing I want to do is turn it over to Peter for just an announcement around some work that the ALA and SLI are doing.
Sure, thanks, Monica. I'll put something in the chat and then I'll talk about it. As I mentioned at the beginning of my opening remarks, the Open Climate Campaign is trying to collect ideas on what libraries can do to help open up climate research. Well, it turns out the American Library Association and the Sustainable Libraries Initiative are also looking for ideas, not necessarily on the same precise point, but on how libraries can help address climate change. Now, one way to read their call for ideas is how libraries can reduce their carbon footprint. But I think they're interested in something a little bit larger, which is how libraries can help share the strategies and solutions developed by the people at their institutions. In other words, provide open access. So Monica and I are listening for ideas that we can share at the OCC page on how libraries can help open up climate research. But when we have a good list, we're going to share it with the American Library Association and the Sustainable Libraries Initiative so that they have the same ideas and they can share them with all their own member institutions. So please share your ideas, at least with Monica. She's collecting these and she'll represent the Open Climate Campaign to the ALA and the SLI.
Thanks, Peter. I've put my email there, my direct email. It's monica@creativecommons.org. So feel free to email me. I will be following up with a recording of the event today, as well as a survey that will give you another opportunity to give us some of these ideas that we want to put together in an action kit for the Open Climate Campaign. So with that, I will once again thank Chris Bourg and Peter Stuber for your insights, your expertise, and your commitment to making research open. And thank you everyone who attended today for your participation and your interest. We'll see you next time. Thank you.